The global center of gravity is shifting. One way we see this clearly is by the number of important conferences that are now being organized outside the collective West. My guest today recently visited 2 of those conferences in China. Dr. Jan Oberg is joining us today again to discuss what he learned there. Jan, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Pascal. It's a great joy to be here. And I suppose you want me to say a few words about these conferences. And
yes,
I'm
also like how because you were invited there, you attended, and they were related to peace and security. And can you maybe talk us a little bit through them?
Yeah, the first one was a huge one with 500 participants from 50 countries, all invited by China, the municipality of Shanghai, the party, and a lot of other high-level also participants and speakers, etc., which was a World Conference of China Studies. And, that was not only a focus on security, but it's a broad variety of culture, of Chinese society, etc., by people all over the world who study China, go to China like me, etc. But I was pretty surprised because I want to emphasize that I'm not a China expert. I never was. I never will become. And what as you know, my inroad to China is I'm interested in China's way of conceiving peace with the 5 principles of coexistence and how they do defense and how they do foreign policy and how the Chinese have a vision about a better world, if you will, with the Belt and Road Initiative and all that. So there was ample opportunity to meet people with, first of all, like-minded, curious about China, which we are not generally in the West. And secondly, to get a lot of input and what other people do who study China, including those who see China as part of a global transformation and a security actor, also a peace actor. And third, what I think is important is that many other countries ought to do the same, because when you bring together 500 people from all over the world, it means dialogue. It means mutual learning. It means exchanging views and, if you will, handling differences also in how we perceive things. And that is something that in and of itself, beyond the academic purpose, actually leads to some kind of peace. It's a step towards peace is mutual understanding, listening to each other, having seminars, saying, oh, I disagree with you. I'm surprised you have those views. Explain them to me more. And, that happens both at the formal conference, but it also happens over dinners and breakfast in the morning at the hotel and things like that. So it was, I wish more countries would do the same, but of course you have to have a lot of money to invite 500 people. So, and the other conference was the 10th anniversary celebration of the Institute of China Study of China, the Institute of China, actually, sorry, it's called the Institute of China at Fudan University, which is run by Professor Zhang Weiwei.
There is this preconceived notion in the West that overall in an autocratic country like China, you cannot speak your mind and there is no real academic freedom. You're free to speak what is party line. What do you say to people who think that?
Go there and see for yourself. That's all I say. I mean, because there's so many. There's an incredible amount of misconceptions, all stemming from media. Ordinary citizens, including my neighbors and others, would say, how can you go to a dictatorship? Why do you go there constantly? It's completely, and I say, excuse me, go there for yourself and see, because that's the only thing that'll convince you. And I tell you, Pascal, I have not met anyone who went to China, travel around for 2 or 3 weeks, either by group tourism or individually like I do, and came home and said, yeah, it was a terrible place. People were very unkind. They all repressed. They all looking gray. It's a clear dictatorship like, Czechoslovakia during the Cold War or Soviet Union. I've never met anybody who came home and said that. Everybody comes back and say, it was totally different from what I read in the media. It has nothing to do with all these stories, And I'm not exaggerating, Pascal. I know lots of people who have not been to China and they have very negative views. And I know even more people who've been to China, travel around, had a reason to go there for business or tourism or whatever, and they come back with a completely different. I'm not saying everything is okay. I mean, this is not the point. The point is that which I phrase and to everybody I talk with, I say, you don't have to be pro-China. You don't have to be anti-China, but you have to be curious about China because it is a fundamentally important country for the future of the world, whether you like it or not. Better learn about it. And second, and learn not from the media. It's impossible to sit in the West and learn about China. That much I can say. You have to go there. And the other thing is that it will enrich your life to meet the Chinese and see what they have done the last 30 to 40 years. It is unique, as far as I can see, in human history. Now, I sound now over positive, etc. But I have seen China in 1983 when I traveled around with a Danish cultural delegation. I saw the poverty. I saw the dirt at the hospitals. I saw the muddy roads. And today, 40 years later, I see the incredible infrastructure, 40,000 kilometers of high-speed trains. I see cleanliness everywhere. I don't see a piece of paper on a railway station. I see happy people. I see consuming people. I see people who have the basics. I see a country in which there's no more poverty.
I mean, you also went to the countryside.
Sorry?
You also went to the countryside, and also if you leave the cities, you still get a modern country.
There is huge contrasts, but there's nobody who suffers. There are people who live completely different lives from Shanghai and Beijing or Hangzhou or whatever. And I went to a small village in the outside, 70 kilometers outside Hangzhou, with 1,500 inhabitants. I tell you, that's a small place. The ancient village Shenao, with 1,500 inhabitants. I lived there for 4 days at a small hotel, and it's the same that people live a very good life, but they live as handicraft people. They live on cultural festivals. They live on cultivating the soil. But there's nobody who's suffering, and people look happy, and people are kind and helpful. Let me give you an example of one of, I don't know how many I've experienced like that as traveling alone. I always travel on my own, and I don't plan where I go. I say in the morning to this to the receptionists the day I've arrived, I said, tell them I would like to go tomorrow morning and see the sunrise over the Fujun River, which, by the way, is that's for another story, but it's part of the art history of China and a modern film, which is called Dwelling in the Fujun Mountains. But that's what stimulated me to go to that place. I say, I'd like to go and see the sunrise. And it was supposed, since I'm a photographer also, it's supposed to be a place where you see the mist and there's a special atmosphere and all that. That turned out not to be so. Can you get me a taxi tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock so I can go to the river? And both of them say, like stereo, you don't have to have a taxi. We'll take you there. 5 o'clock in the morning, the receptionist say, I'll take you there. This is what you experience again and again in China. I'm not romanticizing. I can give you other examples. There is no discussion. It's a very kind and helpful people. They speak a little, not in the village, but some people in the big town speak English. They have English names, and they are going out of their way to be helpful, kind, and to learn from you. That is what is so interesting. They want to learn about us. They want to contact. My wife once said at the Hangzhou, Hangzhou railway station in Shanghai, and a lady comes up and says, may I sit here and exercise my English with you? Where are you from? It is totally amazing openness, which a Chinese would not meet in Sweden.
Now, I mean, we see all of these negative stereotypes, right? And they are getting worse and worse in Europe and in the US, especially when it comes to the social system and to stereotypes about the social system, to stereotypes about security. And when it now comes to framing peace, and you're a peace researcher and you've been doing peace research for all your life, what struck you on how your Chinese counterparts or interlocutors framed peace and the future of humanity?
Well, the formal thing, which is also a reality, is that the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, or the Panchila, developed by India and China, 70 years ago, that is in the constitution of China. That is something you cannot run away from. It's not just something they talk about. It's built into the Chinese constitution. Secondly, I think that the Chinese have understood something that we do not understand really, and particularly not when you look at the peace plan of Donald Trump. I mean, I'm amazed and I'm dismayed and I am feeling tragic that the whole world can call that rubbish a peace plan.
Let's come to that later.
But we'll get to that. Yes, and so the Chinese have I don't know where it comes from, but that's why it's interesting to study it. They built in peace in social actions, in economy, in the way the society is built. They don't have a lot of what I would call the Western repair society, by which I mean, first we have a defense policy. That means I can kill you thousands of kilometers away with offensive deterrence or long-range weapons. That's the NATO in a nutshell. That's offensive deterrence far away. If you don't do what I say, I can kill you far away, which will never, I mean, it should be pretty obvious that will never create stability. Now, then we do that, we get an overarmament problem, we get a militarism problem, and we get wars. And then we say, oh, we need disarmament and peace negotiations and all this, right? What about doing the right thing from the beginning? What about building these things into dialogue, into consultations, into institution building, where we handle conflicts before they break out in violence? And that's a very important distinction. That's the one between conflict and violence. I'm not saying, and that is one of the things I raised in the conferences in China, both of them. I said, it is amazing that among all the things you have imported to China, capitalism, the idea of a party, consumerism, Western art, Western music, and then you have changed it. You've given it, Chinese characteristics. The only thing you have not changed is the importing of militarism, weapons, long-range weapons, and all that. And then, of course, they would say something, well, ours are defensive. Now, nuclear weapons are not defensive. This cannot, by any definition, be called defensive. And other things are not defensive either. But basically, and you and I know that, and everybody knows that, which is why it's so ridiculous to call it a threat. China does not conquer the world, has only one base outside itself, its own country, etc. But they have a different conceptualization of peace and coexistence and listening to each other and dialogue than we have in the West. And that is interesting to me. What I don't understand is two things: why it has led to basically the same type of military, weapons first security politics. And secondly, I'm surprised that, as far as I have been able to find out, Nanjing's university in China is the only one that has something like peace research. And actually, one of my mentors, Johann Gelter, was giving guest lectures there. There is no peace research. There's no peace and conflict studies anywhere, as far as I know, in China. And that is something I'm surprised of. This could be a way to profile China in the future, that among it has, of course, peace and conflict studies, reconciliation, forgiveness studies, nonviolence, etc., studied at its universities, because when you get to the think tanks and the research institutes, it is pretty traditional. I'm not saying it's not highly qualified. I'm saying that it is not infused with the values of academic peace studies. Individuals have it, but it's not institutionalized. So I'm working on the idea that maybe I can do a little thing of spreading peace and conflict studies in China, which I think would be some of the things I would be most proud of in my life if I could achieve that. So I'm saying it when I go to China. I speak with intellectuals and academics, and I do it with great respect, because their policies are different from the West, and they are objects of so much injustices. But I still think it would be a good idea to have academic peace studies in China.
I mean, there's a lot of security studies in the West and in the East. There's a lot of, and security studies often is also a misnomer because it's more the study of how to create calculated insecurity in everywhere in order to somehow feel stability. I mean, a lot of traditional IR studies are basically that, how to create mad and game theory and so on, deterrence, as you already said. Um, did you, is there any other framing, of the international situation that you found profoundly different from the discourse that you were used to, or that you are used to in Europe?
Well, that's a difficult question because when you go to a conference with 500 people from 50 countries, it's not a China thing. It's a world thing, if you will. So there's so many approaches. But let's say that over the years, probably since 45, 90% probably of the books that have been studied by 90% of the students in international relations, political science, doctrine studies, strategic studies have been American books, American scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that China is also very open to Western scholars coming there, speaking, including, Henry Kissinger shortly before he died at the age of 100 years. And they revere these thinkers, Joseph Nye also, etc. Yes, and those influences something we as scholars should, I wouldn't say be anti, because a lot of good stuff has been produced in the United States, but the dominating role must go. There is so much else produced around the world by other scholars, whether in Africa or the Middle East or China or other Asian countries, that it's totally ridiculous that 90%, now I'm saying 90%, this is not empirically proven, but I would say at least I'm a product of it myself, but I'm also a product of the Scandinavian tradition of peace studies and peace and conflict studies that was associated very much with the name of Johan Galtung. I don't see why we should not have global learning and global authors and global books. This is totally possible today at our universities, but it looks like that when I see the curriculum for something called peace studies at a Swedish university. I'm just saying, one, it's not peace. Two, it's all culture-specific Western. There's nobody in Lund University who is studying non-Western theories of international relations or philosophy about peace or something like that, And that is that makes us totally unprepared for the world that is emerging. The difference is that the Chinese know a lot about the West. They've imported a lot of things from the West and given it Chinese characteristics, but they have also a curiosity. First of all, if you are in a shopping mall or something like that, or a restaurant, you will hear Western music or Western inspired music. That's very clear. If you go to any big museum in a big city, at some point every year or every second year, there will be an exhibition of Western art. I mean, Shanghai's Modern Art Museum, when I was there, had a huge exhibition from a Paris museum about French Impressionism. Now, they have sent millions of students to the West who come back and speak English. I mean, you can go on and on and on. The Chinese know tons more about the West than we generally in the West, with exceptions of brilliant scholars who've been curious about it for 40 years or 50 years or 100 years or whatever. We know nothing about China compared with what China knows about the West. And that is going to be absolutely fatal for the Western world. Because of that knowledge, you can exploit and do the propaganda the Americans and Europe do against China. That's only possible because the population don't know anything about China. Otherwise, they would say, hey, that's propaganda.
At the beginning of the talk, you actually framed one of China's signature foreign policies, the Belt and Road Initiative, as a peace project, a connectivity project. In the West, Washington, but also Brussels, they often just portray it as China trying to take over the world, China trying to debt trap countries. But in what way do you think that this connectivity project of China is actually something that can foster and help peace rather than this dystopian image the West tries to paint of it?
Well, I would say from a peace research point of view, it's old hat, Pascal. When you bring people together in some kind of equity relationship and cooperation, not, vertical exploitation, fragmentation, and all that imperialism does, because that has also the idea of cooperation, but it's north-south, and always been, and then we get the most out of it and they get less out of it, right? But if you do it horizontally and you do it with equality, equity, win-win, preferably 50-50, but that's difficult between a huge country and a small country, and there are details and all this that I don't know anything about. But when you do that, and I emphasize win-win, not win-lose, like in colonialism and imperialism, then you build a barrier against starting a war and start killing each other. You see what happens now. Hatred goes totally unlimited in Europe against Russia because there's no cooperation. If we had followed the German and Willy Brandt's idea that we need to cooperate with each other to keep the peace and not start a war against each other, we would have been in a much better place today. But the fools of the West and West started the NATO expansion, antagonized, confronted, humiliated Russia, and Russia reacted, in my view, the wrong way, but they reacted because we did not build cooperation. Now the idea is only sanctions, no cooperation, no energy, etc. We don't want to be dependent. The whole point is that the Chinese have seen, if you get people together, connect people, if they become mutually dependent, equally dependent on each other. You sell this, I buy this, I sell this, and you buy this, and we have a transport network, and we do this, is what Xinjiang is about at the moment. It's going to be the most interesting province in China, in my view, in the future, between China and the West. When you do these things, and you get to know each other, and you cooperate every day, the chances that you start a war and start killing and start hating each other is much smaller than when you don't know each other, don't work with each other, or when you begin to exploit people. It is so, it's embarrassing to say anything this banal on your channel, but that is what it is. We don't understand that in the West. We think that dominating is good. We think that mission is good. Make other people like us. That's the worst thing of the Western culture, is the mission idea. They should be like us. The fourth world should be like the third should be like the second, and the second should be like the first, and we are winning. We have universal values. No, we don't. And the Chinese have understood that. If you try to dominate, if you try to export your own system, then you would only create animosity. Because who are we? Would we like somebody coming and saying to Swedish society that we should practice Sharia law with a missionary idea? No, of course not. So the idea is Chinese are saying, let's cooperate. You don't have to be like us. You don't have to have one party system. You don't have to be Buddhist. You don't have to be Confucianist. You don't have to be this and that. But can we do something together in unity and diversity, peace and diversity, not in uniformity? This is so fascinating for somebody who's worked his whole life with peace and what peace is. Peace is different from culture to culture.
Why is it, do you think, that we in the West seem dead set on portraying, of always having as an other, of always having somebody to portray as an enemy, either an active enemy like Russia or a potential enemy like China. It is true that China has border disputes. China has disputes over islands with Japan, border disputes had border disputes in the north with Russia, but resolved them. Has border disputes with India. There are moments when actually soldiers die on these contact lines, but the last time China invaded another country was in 1979, and that was Vietnam, and there was a lot to unpack there. So why is it that the West is so dead set on projecting extreme violence or extreme violent tensions into China, when the only one who, empirically speaking, uses constantly high violent solutions to their problems is the West? Everywhere in the world, and they project that somehow into China.
Yeah, well, psychopolitical projection is part of the Western decline. You blame others for doing what you do 10 times worse yourself. That's one thing. I think we're into something, Pascal, that others would call deep cosmology or ways of thinking or cultures, which we are increasingly dealing with at the Transnational Foundation, because we're sick and tired of the traditional superficial weapons geopolitical military commentarism that exists, that never gets to a deeper things. Why are things the way they are? And when you get there, you begin to discuss how can they be solved. All this commentarism about what Trump said yesterday, is not going to bring us anywhere. Not a good place, at least. And we are bad academics if we have no ideas about how to find solutions. It's a doctor, the same with a doctor who you go to and he tells you you're terminally ill and I can do nothing. I have no idea what to do. This is not the doctor you'd like to go to. So all these people who are talking about what was said yesterday and militarism and new plans for military security guarantees and stuff like that, in my view, are not getting anywhere. What we're talking about here is less conscious or even subconscious ways of thinking that influences the Western mindset. For instance, we divide everything into good and bad, no gray colors in between, male or female. We divide things into, what I'm saying, dichotomies are important. Instead of standing out saying everybody is a potential friend, you say everybody is a potential enemy. If you have Christianity, there can only be one God. If you are a Buddhist, there can be a little bit more things to believe in or figures to believe in. And this idea of conquering the world and making your own way of thinking universal is delusional. Gandhi was one of the first to point it out. We're not against the British. They can be here, but their system, the way they think, is something we don't accept in India because we have a different culture. So if you want to change these things and really come to what could be changed is the deeper way of thinking of the West, the things we every day take for granted, call natural. Oh, that's how it ought to be. And therefore China is a threat because it has different values and think differently from us. That's the huge limitation of the West. And you have people in NATO and elsewhere who've been saying China is a threat because they have different values from us. I would say, wow, that's wonderful. They're different from us. Let's explore what that means. But because we are on our way down in the West, and all empires go down in the West, and empire is on its way down, we get afraid when somebody has better ideas or different ideas or do things in a different way, and we consider them enemies, right? And that is a civilizational, a Western civilizational disease. Instead of being curious about those who are different, we see them as potential or real threats and enemies. The same goes with immigrants, people from other cultures who come here. They are basically met with a negative attitude. Instead of being open and say, that would be fantastic. And we should be thinking it's fantastic because we have been living on those from other cultures. Earlier, you couldn't buy a shirt, you couldn't buy a transistor radio, you couldn't buy anything. You couldn't buy a car that was not halfway produced somewhere in the third world. Now it's all produced in China. We're so dependent in the Western world on there being a world of people and workers and others doing things that we consume every day, tobacco, coffee, whatever it is. But we're not interested in who these people are. That is our great deficiency in the West. And we're going to wake up. Or if we don't wake up, which I don't think we do at the moment because we're so navel gazing, we're going to lose it.
Yeah.
And I think we are going to lose it. There is no openness at this moment really among politicians, scholars, or media for there being another non-Western world who do things differently, who does things differently from us. There's no such thing in our Western media. Open a Chinese media, go to the internet, open China Daily, open CGTN or whatever, and you see tons of things about the West. Open the Western media and you'll see nothing about China. If you do, it's only that it's a bad country and it's a dictatorship and they're doing this and that bad and they are a threat and we must arm against them. That's the only story. You don't see those stories in the West, in the Chinese media.
Are we caught? And I'm sorry I'm making this about the West now, but it's like, are we caught in our own solipsistic way of existing, that we keep thinking everything is about us, and you know, perceiving even everybody else as just a different version of ourselves, which actually means you perceive the others as yourself, but differently.
Yeah. Or people who could become copies of us. I mean, this is a missionary idea. Go out and go make everybody my Coca-Cola consumers. Human rights activists or whatever it is, we are selling democracy. We, goddamn it, selling democracy all over the world as if it worked in our own societies. It doesn't anymore. It didn't even at the time when we did it. So yes, I think this is something that, Pascal, this is something that has to do with the danger of becoming number one. That is that you don't learn, you teach.
Yeah.
If you're number 10 in a system, you have 9 others and say, how did they make it much better than we did? We got something to be inspired by. But if you're number one, you teach and you don't listen and you don't learn new things. And that, of course, also, I mean, if you should transfer Western thinking on China, China will have to avoid that trap. Being the strongest, most influential country in economic terms, probably in sociological terms, in the way of doing things in the future, in the technological field, that there will be a risk that anybody who becomes number one loses humility, loses wisdom, loses caution, and say, we can do anything. I have good hopes that that will not happen, thanks to Confucianism, thanks to the harmony thinking, thanks to the peace thinking that is deep down in the Chinese culture. But you can never know exactly. You know, there could be a leader long after Xi Jinping or something like that who would have a different attitude from his wisdom and moderation. And so we got to help each other thinking of how do we avoid anybody falling into the trap of arrogance, of thinking we are the center of the world. Now, the bizarre thing for the West is we are what we call the Western world. Pascal, you come from Switzerland, I come from Denmark, live in Sweden. What we call the Western world is 12% of humanity. Now, my simple calculation is if those 12% are not more interested in the 88% and how they live than they are about themselves, 12%, they will lose. They will lose. Because you cannot, as a small minority of 12% in the world community of humanity, you cannot not be interested in the 88%, both if you want to dominate and if you want to cooperate in a multipolar, multinodal world in the future. The new world is either multipolar or non-polar or whatever, but it is not unipolar. And so the end of the US Western dominance of the world is very clear. The only ones who don't see it at the moment are the Westerners themselves, because this is the outlook we have on the world. And this is dangerous. This is a dangerous moment for humanity because there's an empire going to go down, and we do not have a Gorbachev.
How would
We do not have a man of vision, of moral standing, and of humanity that Gorbachev was when he saw that the Soviet Union, the last Western empire, went down. Now the Western empire is going down, and we don't have anybody who would reach to his knees in terms of morals, vision, or humanity.
And what's the right way for not just China, but the entire world to approach this problem that the West is going down? It's good that the West is going down, but it's dangerous that it is going down. So on the one hand, you have an inevitability, but it also comes with inevitable dangers. So what would be the necessary airbags in order to diffuse not just the fall of the West, but the fallout from the fall of the West?
Well, I would have liked to see, and that was my hope way back in the 70s and 80s, that the European Union would be a different West.
Right.
A West that the rest of the world could talk with in a different way, and a non-violent West, because that is part of the Western tradition too, that would not do what the Americans are doing. And now I see a Europe that has no independent standing, who is going from creating one crisis for itself after the other, whether it's the war on Russia through the proxy role of Ukraine, or it's now that, there's going to be make peace. God forbid, no, don't ever use that about Trump's plan. There's going to be make peace without Europe. And there's anxious now coming together and say, you cannot do it without us. And Trump says, I couldn't care less about you. And so says Putin, of course, they agree. And there's been nothing new created by the European Union, such as what could only be done by you being a union instead of individual countries. So that would have been one answer years back, that perhaps the European Union could be a new West that allied with, got into the global world in a different way, not dominating, but cooperating, mutual win-win European Union and the rest of the world. They have not been able to do that. They haven't had the vision. And today is the worst leadership of European Union we have had for all these years. And so what I think I could say is, you can hope for something falling really apart in the United States. And Trump is a very good destroyer also of the United States and everything good it stood for. Parenthesis, I've never been anti-American. But somebody could come up in the United States and said, hey, we got to do it differently. This is time for change. Some Martin Luther King like, Kennedy like, or maybe Carter like figure. But that's maybe not something we even have time for waiting for.
No, that's why I'm
so
wondering.
The future, just let me find it. The final point is, the future will be either explosion or implosion. Explosion means the United States will go down through warfare. I used to say, what would Hitler have done if he had had tactical nuclear weapons available in his bunker in Berlin? The other one is implosion. That is simply slowly, step by step, sector by sector, the United States as an empire will fall apart. Economic crisis, social crisis, cultural crisis. It comes together suddenly and the whole thing falls apart. It implodes. And that's what I would hope for as the least violent way for the empire to go. But it must go, and it will go. We should have a discussion in the West. How do we go as an empire and join the rest of the world in a new way? We don't have that discussion because we are bent. Our media, our politicians, our scholars are bent on continuing to dominate the world because everybody else is worse than us.
How about joining by invitation? It's like, one thing that struck me with the 28-point peace plan was that one of the points in there was the offer, like, we will reintegrate Russia into the G8. And me and a lot of others are like, but they never asked for that. It's like, why would Russia want that? But okay, they're like, okay, we got off of that. But
And I think they have better options than doing that.
precisely. But how about the opposite? What do you think would happen if for the next BRICS meeting, BRICS just invited the United States? Come and talk to us, because okay, maybe this is far away.
I don't know what Pascal. Could you just repeat that question, because I get the message there's a little internet stopping here. You froze.
Sorry, the question was
question again.
The question was, what if BRICS started inviting the United States, for instance, as an observer? Please join us as an observer. Come and discuss with us. Do you think that might be a way forward?
No, look at it. I mean, they didn't turn up at the G20 in South Africa just last week, with some kind of fake story about all white people being object of genocide or something like that. I think the present American leadership, or lack of leadership, has, or misleadership, has this idea of self-isolation, which is why they want to grab resources in Canada and Greenland and Panama and outside Gaza, etc., because they know, I call it the United States of autarky. They are withdrawing from the world, if you will, and then ravaging the place to their own liking. And so I would love to believe that it would be possible, and maybe with another leadership, but that's not Trump. Trump doesn't care about cooperation, and he doesn't even care to cooperate with NATO members and the EU. So inviting the United States to participate in BRICS, I would do it, but it would merely illustrate that they don't want to cooperate with the world. They want to dominate the world. And as long as that disease is so deep in the soul, in the way of thinking of the West, we are all having a problem.
You know, the most successful approach during the Cold War, in my view, politically speaking, in order to get to de-escalation and get to a constructive way forward during the Cold War, was the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that was a 5-year-long endeavor. And it was actually the idea of the Soviets. And the Soviets knew that if they pitched the idea, because they tried, the West will just say, like, no. I mean, there's a stupid ploy. We will never say yes. So what they did is they told the Finns. The Finns, they told them, please ask the Europeans, and then later the US, that we need some form of conference. And the Finns did it. The foreign ministry of Finland actually then sent out these notes. And by sending out notes, they created the diplomatic pressure that, well, you need to reply, because even no reply is a reply, and it's a very unfriendly reply, right? So you need to create something. And that spiraled and snowballed into something that 5 years later became the largest kind of transcontinental peace effort of the Cold War.
Absolutely. I agree completely with you. And we are probably thinking, because we're both fans of neutrality and
of Finland. Finland is awesome.
And Finland, and you know, it's all gone by now. Finland is a staunch believer in NATO, which is organization
used to be awesome.
A number of reasons should be abolished. But long story short, you know, those were the days, Pascal, in the sense that you had intellectuals leading Europe. You had people like Willy Brandt. You had people like Palme. You had people like Kekkonen, who took the initiative, if I remember correctly, to the OSCE. And the idea was that by having contacts, including military people meeting at each other's exercises, we would prevent war, and we would have an Ostpolitik, meaning we would cooperate. We would also have a Germany who did not talk about militarism, but talked about what it had done and repented it. And we had Olof Palme's idea, commission of common security. Now we have security to the detriment of the others. We think stupidly, because there's no intellectualism left in Europe as policies. We believe that the more we can harm, the more we can humiliate, the more we can look strong militarily, the more we will have peace. Of course we won't. But that understanding was different, because you had it also because, one, intellectualism. Two, you had people who knew what war was, who were running Europe at that time. People sitting today don't know what war is. It's a game on a computer kind of thing. They're not even aware what they're playing with. So you are so right. That's what we need today, in my view, too. And maybe we should think about how to change Europe in that direction, because I think it's rather impossible to influence the United States. It's a kind of, autistic mood. But Europe, where we both have our roots, could probably still do something different.
Yeah.
But I'm not optimistic when I look at the way they have treated Russia. They expanded NATO. The way they have handled Nord Stream and whatever just gives me, bad feelings for the ability to even think in peace terms. I don't think if you asked Madame von der Leyen, what is peace to you, she wouldn't be able to say anything interesting. You wouldn't be able to have a conversation for 5 minutes at your channel here with her about peace, because it would be blah. The strong defense, militarism, show the other party where we are, and it's everything else but that. And that's why we're living in dangerous times.
I don't know. At some point, Europe will snap out of it. We will come back. It's just the question to me is how long is this break on rationality, the break on rationality that Europe is currently taking, is it gonna last another 10 years or another 100 years? It's like, I don't know how long it will take, but at some point it must come back, because it's getting so obvious and even stronger. And I do believe, like, on the ground, at some point, like, it's just this Gorbachev realization, like, we cannot go on living like that. This will come to Europe, but it's not yet there, but it will come.
Well, we are definitely moving towards the marginal values and the marginality of what can be done without a big bang. One could say, let's be creative and positive. One could say that if Trump and Putin, and Trump particularly because these 28 points are, according to all sources, his and not those of Putin, or certainly not of Ukraine's people. I'm not talking about Zelensky anymore. The only thing that interests me is the future of the Ukrainian people, who've suffered more than anyone. If they carry through this bizarre, amateurish, Quakery peace, that will probably a wake-up call for Europe. It could lead to the end of NATO. Because if the strongest power in NATO does this over and above the heads of Europe and its allies, these allies might finally see that they cannot gamble on a cooperation with or closeness to the United States, under Trump at least. And that will force some reasonably intelligent people to begin to say, where do we turn to when we can no longer trust the United States? And it may also grab Greenland in the future, and it will do bad things in Ukraine, etc., because it's nothing to do with peace. There will be more war. If they are humiliated to that extent by Trump making his 28 points work with Putin over and above the Ukrainian heads and the Europeans' heads, I think that could be a wake-up call in the direction of what you talk about. But I don't know. The capacity for Europe to humiliate itself has been mind-boggling to me, because there's no leadership in Europe that is worth it.
But why not try peace through humiliation? I mean, maybe. The other approaches Europe tried so far didn't usually end very well every other decade. But Jan, thank you very much for these insights. I'm always glad to hear your thinking and your process of conceptualizing peace, which I think is very important. People who want to read more from you, they should go to the transnational the TH.
Yeah, transnational.live.
Transnational.live and
our Substack.
And your Substack.
And then we have hundreds of videos, like the one not as good as this one, but we have all these videos that we've done too. We are working very much with media outside the West. Nobody in the West are interested in what we're saying. Peace by peaceful means is totally uninteresting to Western media, but we work with media all around the world, and tons of videos also for people who do not want to read long academic articles, which we still produce. But let me thank you also, Pascal, because you are one of the very few places, one of the few individuals who are interested in peace. And that's what I really respect and admire, because you come from a Switzerland tradition, I guess, and because it's part of your personality. You've seen the absurdity in threatening and using violence to solve no problems, but only create more problems. We are very few people around the world who have that attitude, but I'm grateful that you have it.
Peace is like health. It's not everything, but everything is nothing without it. So we better care about it.
Exactly. And, Johann Galtung always, whose father was a doctor, always said a good peace researcher does diagnosis, prognosis. Some of them will tell you that if we continue this way, it'll go wrong. And then you spend the most of your energy and intellectual capacity on saying, how do we avoid the worst and how do we create something better? That is treatment.
Yeah,
and that's what we are committed to in this foundation. And I've been now for exactly 40 years on the 1st of January next year. We have always said, you've not done research before you've also suggested some solutions to the problem. And that's what a good doctor does. And that's what a good peace researcher does. And that's what basically no intellectuals do anymore.
I'm looking for a therapy to this cancer of war, and I would prefer it not to be radio inhalation therapy. That, brings us back, rest in peace is not the peace we want. We want active peace where people can enjoy it. Okay.
Peace is conviviality and happiness and developing potentials that every human being and societies have for something better than killing each other.
Jan Oberg, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.